Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Alright, hello everyone, welcome to the 13th episode of the Caffeine Stream, the podcast of Caffeine and Philosophy. I'm your host, C.D. Robertson, you can call me Chris, and today I'm finally getting around to something that I wanted to talk about at the very beginning of this whole podcast. Early in the podcast, I talked with Ben Brower, who was involved in the anarcho-primitivist movement back in the 90s, and we talked about that. Very great conversation. But my initial plan had been to talk about anarcho-primitivism in juxtaposition with a parallel and opposite movement that I think is also coming to the fore, which is transhumanism. Ben Brower, unfortunately, turned out to be too interesting of a guest, and we just talked anarcho-primitivism, which was, super fun. And I'm glad it worked out that way, because transhumanism is one of those subjects that's tied in with a lot of other things. One of those things is utilitarianism. I have been very critical of utilitarianism, and especially of one of its main voices in today's world of moral philosophy, and that is Sam Harris. And so, given Sam Harris suddenly hitting the public eye in the last, week over some immensely stupid comments, it feels appropriate to finally dive into this, and we'll talk about behavioral economics and transhumanism sort of springboarding off this at some point. We have another potential guest lined up to talk about other cool things related to Homer. But that's a tangent for another time. So let's dive into utilitarianism. What is utilitarianism? And is it right to call Sam Harris a utilitarian? I don't want this podcast to be about Sam Harris. He just happens to be someone who's relevant at the moment. But he's relevant because the things he says are not that far off from the things that Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill have said. And to a degree, I would say what the Greek hedonists, so like the Pythagoreans, would have said, although it wasn't called or understood as utilitarianism back in the time. You can still trace the thinking to Pythagoras and this, enlightened hedonist view of what morality entails. To the point that modern utilitarians actually refer to the unit of utility as hedons. Just a funny verbal thing for people to remember. But that doesn't get to the question of what is utilitarianism. So I'm going to go on one more little tangent. And before we get into utilitarianism proper, I want to bring up all 5 of the major theories of morality, because I think it's important to prime this subject with this background first. So there are 5 major theories of morality. The first and the oldest, and in many ways the simplest, is divine command theory. Divine command theory holds that the foundation for morality is the will of God. If God wills something, that is the right thing to do. This is biting the bullet on the Euthyphro dilemma, where Socrates asks, are things good because the gods do it, or do gods do it because it's good? Basically, which comes first, God or morality? Socrates is sort of the progenitor of virtue ethics, which we'll get into in a second. But divine command is the first track of that dilemma. It says, no, morality comes from God, and following God's will and God's commands is the origin and source of morality and ethics. So that's the first theory, divine command theory. Very simple. The second one, which, as I just said, Socrates sort of laid the foundations for, but which didn't really come into its own until Aristotle, is virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics is kind of an interesting one. It's my own preferred foundation, also, full disclosure. And there's a couple different parts to it. There's an epistemological component, because Aristotle says in Nicomachean Ethics, a hungry man will think that food is the highest good, and a poor and socially outcast man will think that wealth and power is the highest good, and all sorts of things of externalities influence our perception of the good, and in some cases twist our perception of the good. So acquiring virtue, which just means excellence, really. Virtue is excellence. So becoming an excellent person, becoming competent in as many domains of life as possible, is a foundation for being able to discern the good in the first place. So, because if you are established and are skilled in things, you'll be less likely to have your view skewed by pressing absences. But the more important thing, and really the core of virtue ethics, is this idea that there is a telos, there is a purpose and a proper end to a human life. And the virtues, so like strength would be a virtue. Well, why isn't weakness a virtue? Well, it's because the purpose and proper end of a human being entails certain qualities and not others, and it rewards certain qualities and not others. But rewards not in a sense of like cause and effect. Maybe reward is the wrong phrase for that. Certain virtues, certain excellences exemplify and elevate the proper aspects of a human being better than others. So a human being should be strong, because being strong is a component of being human. One could say being able to read and think and use words, to be manually competent. All of these are components of what it means to be a human. And so the proper end of a person is the source of these excellences, these virtues, and it is proper, it is good, both to be able to discern the good and to embody it, to cultivate these virtues, these dispositions of excellence. And that, according to Aristotle, is the foundation for morality. And then, moving very far forward, beyond Aristotle in the 3rd century BC, we get into Immanuel Kant in the late Middle Ages, sort of the early, almost just barely pre-Enlightenment. He's sort of the harbinger of the Enlightenment. And Immanuel Kant offered a third option for morality, and he called this deontology, or transcendentalism. Deontology etymologically refers to duties. And the important thing about deontological ethics and transcendentalism is that Kant thought that if something is to be moral, if an action or a behavior is to be moral, the action has to be intrinsically moral, not as a means to some end. So for Kant, lying, for example, would be an example of an immoral action. So there's no cause and effect sequence of events that would justify lying as a moral act. If morality is to mean anything at all, according to Kant, it has to do with the intrinsic morality or immorality of discrete acts as ends in and of themselves. This is sometimes known as or a component of the categorical imperative. But what Kant did was he severed morality from causality and from the effects of actions. And it said morality has to do with fulfilling duties and performing right actions no matter the cost. Fiat justitia ruat caelum, as the Romans might say. So we have divine command theory, virtue ethics, and deontology. I'm going to jump to 5 because it's, 4 is the subject of this podcast. 5 is nihilism, also very simple. Nihilism holds that all theories of morality are fictions and created just for the benefit of certain people and not others. And there's really no point to taking any of that seriously. It's all linguistic constructs and just self-delusion. There are some reasonably compelling arguments for nihilism, but the problem is that it's not functional at all. It gives you no direction to act. And as C.S. Lewis says in the beginning of Mere Christianity, everyone acts as if morality is a real thing. Even the nihilist will, when the cards are not in his favor and people act against him, will claim that he's been wronged and mistreated and so forth, and he'll appeal to some moral code, perhaps cynically, but perhaps not. There are some pretty good reasons to think that people care about fairness at a very, very young age, and even animals, even non-human animals, have this sense. So nihilism seems maybe biologically suspect as well as philosophically suspect. But anyways, I don't want to spend too much time talking about nihilism. What I want to dwell on here is number 4, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the belief that all of morality has to do with utility. Well, what is utility? Utility is basically like your experience of the world. Positive utility is pleasure, and negative utility is pain and suffering. And this comes really first from Jeremy Bentham, was really fully fleshed out and articulated by John Stuart Mill in his book Utilitarianism. And I would argue that it has its origins with the Pythagoreans and their enlightened hedonism. But I'm sure I'm repeating myself here. I wanted to begin with this breakdown of the 5 moral theories before I come back to Sam Harris here. Sam Harris has been raked over the coals because in an interview this past week, he said that he thought it was justified that there was a left-wing conspiracy to hide the Hunter Biden laptop story. This is back in the late 2019 when that story broke, and certain news platforms actually got censored for posting the story and had their accounts removed temporarily so that the story wouldn't get traction. And Sam Harris says this is absolutely justified and important because Trump was that much of an existential threat. And he said, I wouldn't have cared if there could have been dead children in Hunter Biden's basement that were revealed as a story, and I wouldn't care. It's that important. Now, that's a to most people, I think, would be taken as a remarkably immoral statement. And people take this as an example of Trump derangement syndrome, which is this idea that there are intelligent people out there who are clear thinking and smart people, but something about Trump brings out an emotional reaction that makes them stupid, that makes them unable to accurately understand certain stories, certain facts, makes them more inclined to buy propaganda stories, and so forth. I take a sort of converse approach to that. I think that Trump derangement syndrome, or what we call that, what it actually does is it reveals a poor thinking that existed prior to Trump entering the stage. And my case in point with this is a TED Talk that Sam Harris gave back in 2010 called Science Can Answer Moral Questions. I'll include links to both the interview and to this TED Talk he gave in the description here. And it's an important interview because at one point Sam Harris is basically laying out the argument he makes in his book, The Moral Landscape, which I read back around, in the early 2010s. It's a very, very utilitarian framework for the book. But at one point in the TED Talk, he says, quote, "There is no version of human morality and human values that I've ever come across that is not at some point reducible to a concern about conscious experience and its possible changes." End quote. Now, this is essentially summarizing utilitarianism, the philosophy of utilitarianism. All of morality has to do with conscious experience and its possible changes. I don't think we would ever hear Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill say something so stupid as, "There is no version of human morality and human values that I've ever come across that is not at some point reducible to utility." This is why I opened with the 5 moral theories. Divine command theory is not reducible in that way. Virtue ethics is not reducible in that way. Deontology is defined in opposition to that kind of reductionism. And of course, nihilism is thinks this is all nonsense. Anyways, so off the bat, for those of you who aren't aware, Sam Harris has a master's degree in philosophy in addition to his PhD in neuroscience. If there is anyone, and writes books about morality, if there is anyone who should know better than to make such a statement, and this is something he repeats ad nauseum. This isn't just a one-off, off-the-cuff mistake in a planned speech. This is a consistent point of his worldview and of his view of morality. That all of morality, not only is all of morality reducible to conscious experience and its possible changes, but it's in some way incomprehensible and nonsensical to even talk about morality. I think, if I remember correctly in his talk, he said, "If you think that morality is something else, I don't know what you're talking about." To which, any theist and Aristotle and Kant would cock an eyebrow and be like, "Really?" So I want to run through some of the standard criticisms of utilitarianism, which are the quantification challenge and the vice and vice traps. But I also want to go through my challenges, and I don't know if anyone else has talked about this, but they entail the flexibility of experience in interpreting, or the flexibility of our interpretation of our experience, as well as both the totalitarian and the antinatal inclinations of utilitarianism. So let's start with the basics. The sort of standard criticisms of utilitarianism are the quantification problems. How do you measure utility? How do you measure positive and negative experiences and weigh them against each other? What is a hedon, and how do you compare sort of unlike experiences? Aren't there qualities of experience that aren't fungible in this way? The classic, the whole world of philosophy was obsessed with this one fucking problem for a decade a while back, and that is trolley problems. Trolley problems are a classical criticism of utilitarianism, and it's just an intuition pump, as Daniel Dennett would say, that points out a qualitative difference in certain actions. And there's a million different versions of it. The basic version of it is, there's a trolley going down a track, and there are 5 people tied to the track. They're going to get run over by this trolley unless something is done. Now, fortunately, there's a diverging path, and you can pull a lever and divert the trolley to the other track. But there's 1 person on the other track. So if you pull the lever, you kill 1 person, but you save 5. Would you do it? The vast majority of people will say, yes, I would pull the lever to kill 1 person and save 5. Now, part 2 of the trolley problem is, now suppose it's just 1 track. There's no divergent track. There's no lever to pull. There's none of that. But there is an overpass, and you're standing on the overpass watching this trolley approach the 5 people strapped to the track, and there's an extraordinarily fat person standing next to you on this overpass, and you realize that you could push the fat person over the balcony, and the fat person is so incredibly fat that they would stop the trolley and save the other 5 people. The vast majority of people, when presented with this alternative situation, with exactly the same moral calculation in lives and lives saved, say they would not push the fat person over. Why not? It feels like there is something significantly different, morally different, between pulling a lever and pushing a human being off of the overpass. There's no actual difference in outcome, but we feel like there is. And the utilitarian would counter and say, well, like, the intuition being appealed to here, this is one of those very, counterfactual, very unrealistic situation that, pits your intuition against what is actually right. And it would be right to push the fat person off. But it doesn't describe the moral feelings that we have that would motivate a desire to maximize utility in the first place. Why is it good to maximize utility, we might say. The nihilist might say. So anyways, there's a whole host of variations and versions of trolley problems. There's hospital waiting rooms, there's children drowning in bathtubs, and the difference between actively drowning them or negligently letting them drown, or things of that nature. There's a whole class of problems related to utility monsters, which are funny as well. Hypothetical beings who, they sense their experience so intensely that maximizing their utility and minimizing their negative utility actually is mathematically the best thing you would do to maximize the greatest possible happiness for the greatest possible number of people. So that's the gist of the quantification challenge. And there's probably hundreds of thousands of papers on this. This is one of the most debated and talked about subjects in moral philosophy, is utility, and how do you measure utility, and the various thought experiments that people get PhDs by summoning up in their head and writing about. And then so that's one of the standard criticisms. The second standard criticism that you might hear are vices and vice traps. So when someone gets high on heroin, what's morally wrong with that? I mean, for virtue ethicists, this is very easy to say. Divine command theorists, well, God says don't do that. Nihilists say, do what you want, I suppose. Deontologists might say, like, no, doing that is, objectively wrong for some, duty reason. I'm not particularly interested. But with the utilitarian, it's a little trickier because many drugs do maximize happiness. Or, in the case of something like an opiate or or heroin, it reduces negative utility quite dramatically. That's why they're so addictive to many people. Even alcohol does this to a degree. So what's the problem with just drugging yourself into a blissful stupor your whole life? Now we might say, well, that's just not sustainable, right? You're gonna have a good time for a short time, and then you're gonna have a bad time, and you're just deferring negative utility. But we are approaching a point, or at least we're told we're approaching a point, economically, where suppose robots can essentially run our economy for us, and we reach a stage where so much of our economy is automated that the vast majority of people really could sustainably exist in a stupor of drugged out euphoria for their entire lives. And a small class of people who just weren't interested in that for whatever reason just kind of maintain things. And these people just exist in a stupefied state of orgasmic pleasure until they die, with synthetic drugs that have little risk of harm, and that's just how they live. There's very little utilitarianism offers in the way of explaining why that would be a bad thing. You can come up with all kinds of arguments that say, well, that's such a low resolution form of consciousness. That's such a there are higher possible modes of being and experiencing the world that these people are missing out on. But when you compare that to the cost of achieving such states, and when you compare that to the negative utility that would be avoided, and also when you compare it to just what state could Sam Harris and his Buddhist imagination dream up that a drug could not theoretically induce? There something feels wrong about that. Something feels wrong in an existential, this is not how things are supposed to be kind of way. There's something qualitatively wrong with this maximization of quantitative utility. The hedons are maximized in such an environment, at least among human beings. It's not a vice exactly, but it's an example of one of these types of behaviors that today we consider to be a vice, and sometimes we justify these things because of their effects. Like we'll say, for example, that incest is wrong because of the negative potential genetic effects that might have. You might have a Down syndrome child, or you might have other, negative effects of incest. But there's a whole other ethical frame that says, no, this act is intrinsically wrong. Even if you have no children, even if you do anything else, it is wrong. It is inappropriate intrinsically to have sexual relations with family members. And this is a view that most moral theories have towards vices, which utilitarianism can really only understand as a vice if there's a negative consequence on the other side. Like, well, incest would be one example, or staying high on opiates all the time is bad because of negative effects. But if those negative effects were removed, then there's nothing actually inherently wrong with the action. And so these sorts of vice traps open up that make people feel icky. And the utilitarian would just say, well, that's just a holdover emotional attachment based on cause and effect relationships from the past, but that'll go away. Just look at what's happened with sex generally, after contraception, which is, I would say, the jury's still a little bit out on, but we'll see where that ends up in a couple hundred years. So those are the standard criticisms: the quantification, vices, and vice traps. But one of the big criticisms I have is that the experience of pleasure and pain is, for human beings, a feedback loop. It's something that we experience that our body uses to try to guide our behavior. Touching a hot stove, there's no biological reason why touching a hot stove has to hurt. Nature could have just as easily given us no pain receptors in that way, psychologically or physically in our fingers. Of course, the effect of that is that we get hurt. There are some people who don't. There are some people who don't experience pain in the way that normal people do, and it's very, very rare for them to live past their early teens because they get hurt, and they don't learn, and they don't fix behaviors that get them hurt. And we can experience this sort of at a more localized level when we learn a new skill or a new dimension of life. I remember when I was doing trim carpentry for a little while, like after a few months, I got to a stage where I couldn't, walk into some, new building or house and not notice how the base molding and the window casings had been done. How the if there's crown molding, how was that done? As an electrician now, I have a very similar experience when I walk into a commercial space, especially retail spaces where everything's kind of exposed on the ceiling. You walk into a Walmart, you can see, pipe and metallic clad, copper running down the ceiling to the cashier machines and so forth. And you just notice things that are well done or not very well done based on experience. And something can strike me as, oh man, that's a work of beauty or a work of absolute garbage. And I have an experience of utility, positive or negative, based upon my subjective experience that preceded it, that my friend who maybe isn't an electrician or just doesn't care, doesn't experience. Much of our subjective experience of the world is like this. It's guided based upon association, based on memory, based to a degree today on hypnotism and brainwashing, but also on our purpose, on like what are we trying to accomplish in our lives right now. If we are, trying to get a woman, for example, there's this girl we like at the bar, and we're just wish we could spend more time with her. And you get a check from your work that says you did a fantastic job last year. Here's a $5,000 bonus. Here you go. Thanks for your work. That's gonna make you feel kind of good, but the woman is at the top of your mind. Now contrast that with the married guy who is married, but he has 4 kids. They're living in a single wide. They're struggling to get by. He's got debts up to his eyeballs, and they're not sure if they're going to make the mortgage payment. And he receives the same check from his employer, $5,000 bonus. Here you go. Thanks for your great work. Completely different experience of utility from there, based upon, and you could say, well, that's based on context or whatever, but it's deeper than just context, because a man in that position who is maybe a sociopath and just doesn't care might appreciate that check for different reasons than the man who's genuinely grateful to be able to put diapers on his kids and food on the table. All kinds of different psychological factors go into our perception of the world and treat it as positive or negative. So even the idea, not just that utility could be this set and fungible thing that could be calculated, but that utility could ever even be some kind of guide. That utility could be some kind of metric for whether you are living right or not, apart from or prior to the experiences and goals that dictate whether our experiences are felt as positive or negative, is circular and is putting the cart before the horse. So the flexibility and subjective nature of how we interpret our experiences itself, I think, negates utilitarianism. It makes our subjective experience of the world if not quite amoral, then at least like the flimsiest of flimsy moral foundations to judge whether an action is moral or not. So the flexibility part of it is I think silly, and this is really where the virtue ethics and deontology and divine command shine, and where Sam Harris, I think, misunderstands them at a very, very deep level, because he believes that at a certain point, like, virtue ethics are true, or deontology might have some good things to say, but really what Kant and Aristotle were just trying to get at was just a system for maximizing utility. And that's not what they're trying to do at all. They're absolutely not just trying to maximize utility, and this was the system they came up with. The proper end of a human being for Aristotle, or the intrinsic morality or immorality of an action for Kant, happen completely outside of, or could exist completely apart from, and indeed for Kant very explicitly does exist, totally apart from our subjective experience of the world. And there's another classical philosophical thought experiment that we could use to illustrate this. You'll often, if you read too many philosophical papers, you might hear about philosophical zombies. A philosophical zombie is a human being who is not conscious. It's a person whom it's not like anything to be them. They have no they move through the world, they talk to you, they can be intelligent, they can reason through things, but it's not like anything to be them. They have no no experience of the tone of existence. They're like automata in a way. It's a philosophical thought experiment, so bear with me here. Virtue ethics and deontology and divine command theory could be applied to philosophical zombies, whereas utilitarianism could not, because there's no utility to work with. There's no utility to maximize. A utilitarian would say they are amoral entities, like rocks or trees. Well, maybe not trees, but like rocks. So that's the flexibility of experience and flexibility of interpreting our experiences, I think, destroys utilitarianism by itself. But I don't think that's enough to really explain why utilitarianism is so bad, because that sort of frame hasn't been enough to stop utilitarians from becoming as popular as someone like Sam Harris. So there's two parallel trajectories and perhaps related trajectories that utilitarianism puts us on, I think, on par with divine command theory, and much, much, much more so than deontology or virtue ethics. And it wouldn't be fair to utilitarianism to leave divine command out of this problem as well, but we're not talking about that. Utilitarianism has a tendency towards totalitarianism. We can call it the totalitarianism of the bean counters. How many hedons is this movement? And the issue is basically this: utilitarianism has to manage utility. If utilitarianism is accepted, everyone is brought into the problem, because utility is looked at as a whole. It's looked at as an aggregate. Actually, let me jump over to Utilitarianism here, John Stuart Mill's book. The creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals utility or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. To give a clear view of the moral standards set up by the theory, much more requires to be said, in particular, which things it includes in the ideas of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. But the important line there is the greatest happiness principle. And this is always the greatest possible happiness for the greatest number of people. This is Sam Harris. I won't say plagiarizes this, because he's his own brand of utilitarianism. He's building off of Mill, but he says the greatest, basically the same thing. The greatest possible happiness and the least pain for the most number of people. And he talks about this in the negative with his worst possible universe thought experiment, where he says, imagine a world where the most possible number of beings are suffering the maximum amount of time to the maximum degree. Level 10 suffering and pain for forever. That is bad. And everything away from that is good. That's Sam Harris's brilliant distillation of I shouldn't be snarky, because it is a good foundation, and it says something important about the difference between positive utility and negative utility, which we'll get into in a minute in talking about antinatalism. But it's the universality of this calculation, of bringing all conscious beings into the equation, necessarily puts everybody into the same system. And this system has to be managed. Managed by who? Well, that's a great question. Glad you asked. There are a number of people who believe that they know the right factors in order to make this kind of calculation. But in order to manage utility for the greatest possible good, it requires other people to be managed in this system. And so utilitarianism necessarily has to tend toward a planned, not just a planned economy, but a planned society with individuals living planned lives, managed lives by a philosopher, manager, council, or system, or elite that do this. So that's the, aside from utilitarianism being, I think, wrong just by the nature of our experience of our subjective experience of the world, it also has this tendency towards totalitarianism. But worse even than that. Yes, but it does get worse. Utilitarianism tends towards antinatalism, which is to say to the eradication of people, to not genocide, because at least genocide is specific and limited to one group, as bad as that is. Antinatalism says, no, we should stop bringing people into the world. We should stop bringing people into the world and stop having children, and perhaps even hasten that along. There is a famous utilitarian who makes this position, and I believe David Benatar, who's that antinatalist, and Sam Harris have had some disagreements in the past. So I'll have to go back and revisit that. But the idea is that suffering and pain are, in our subjective experience, in a sense, more real. They're more concrete. They're more urgent than pleasure. We can forego pleasure, and get along. We don't like it, but if we were going to, have sex with our spouse, but for some reason couldn't tonight, oh, that sucks, but okay, we can pass up on that, and life goes on. If you have, a broken limb, if you have, sadness as a result of the death of your spouse or child, or some other kind of intense suffering that would be equivalent in its negative direction to the positive pleasure of sex, you can't put that off. That has to be addressed and dealt with urgently. People don't have the patience to endure pain in the way that they have the patience to put off pleasure. And this is something that has been observed by countless thinkers and philosophers around the world and across all time. This is why people like the Buddha and Jordan Peterson say that life actually is suffering. And so the final conclusion of utilitarianism, especially from Sam Harris's Worst Possible World foundation, though he might not like to admit it, is, the best way to reduce utility is to go to a net zero with just less life. Just don't bring children into the world. Don't create more people. And perhaps, possibly, even kill some of them a little sooner. It'll reduce their suffering. Put them out of their misery. Because, they say, morality has only to do with, our subjective experience of the world and the nature of maximizing utility, or at least minimizing negative utility, for all conscious creatures, puts us all in the same basket. It tends in that direction. So I think I've gone on long enough. We'll call it a podcast for today on why utilitarianism sucks, why it's wrong, why it's evil, why it doesn't hold up to what you could even make an argument that utilitarianism is worse than nihilism, because at least the nihilist will probably leave you alone. But, utilitarianism, it really does remind me of that C.S. Lewis quote, where he says, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason or those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. End quote. And I think that it's really hard not to listen to the way that behavioral economists and utilitarians and transhumanists talk about the masses, to talk about average people, and to not hear that kind of contempt and disgust, that kind of treating people as, stupid animals to be herded and guided, Cass Sunstein nudged along on the correct path. Nihilists may be cruel in a Nietzschean kind of way, but at least they aren't compelled in this way. So anyways, I've gone on long enough. This is already 45 minutes. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you about other lovely subjects next time.